Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, AI Developments Industry, Thursday, July 16. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There's a moment in the current news cycle that most people scroll straight past, and I'd like to begin by lingering on it, because I think it contains the whole shape of where we are. On one day, more or less, we get 3 announcements. A frontier lab ships a new flagship family of models, 3 sizes, aggressive pricing, benchmark claims about long-running professional work across dozens of fields. On the same stretch of calendar, a research organization devoted to the safety of these systems publishes an argument with a rather deflating thesis that the bottleneck for AI safety is no longer research at all. That we already know, more or less, what best practices ought to look like, and the actual constraint is that almost none of the 1,000-odd most influential policymakers on Earth have ever had a single serious conversation about catastrophic risk. And then, quietly, off to the side, a developer releases a .upgrade to a small database utility that lets you feed it a block of Python to generate rows of data. Now, a casual reader files these under 3 different folders. One is business news, one is the doomers being gloomy again, and the third isn't news at all, it's plumbing. But here is the non-obvious connection, the thing I want you to carry through the whole of today's conversation. All 3 are describing the same phenomenon from 3 different distances. And the phenomenon is this. The capability of these systems is now advancing faster than our ability to understand, govern, or even narrate what they are doing, and the gap is not closing. It is widening, and it is widening in a peculiar, asymmetric way. Consider the flagship model launch. The headline number is that it does better on something called an agent's exam, long-running professional workflows, the kind of thing where system chews on a task for hours and returns finished work. That's the marketed frontier. Autonomy, duration, the ability to act across your files and your applications with your permission. But buried in the same week, the same lab quietly concedes that on a rigorous software engineering benchmark, a rival crushes it, and it responds not by winning, but by publishing a critique of the benchmark itself. That tells you something. We have reached the stage where the measuring instruments are themselves contested terrain. When you can no longer agree on the ruler, you are no longer really measuring, you are negotiating. Meanwhile, and this is the second distance, another set of researchers has spent enormous effort building tools to peer inside these models. A hidden space where the model appears to puzzle over concepts. A technique to read out, in plain English, what a network is supposedly thinking, and what do they find when they interrogate those readouts? That a system can be trained to describe its own internal states with near-perfect fluency and be almost entirely wrong, emitting implausible explanations 99% of the time, while scoring just as well on reconstruction as an honest one. Read that slowly. The instruments we built to understand the machines can be confidently, articulately mistaken. So even our microscope has a reliability problem, so we have capability racing ahead. We have interpretability struggling to keep pace and unsure of its own footing when it does. And then we have the third distance, the political one, telling us that the whole apparatus of research, the papers, the microscopes, the clever proofs, may be beside the point, because the people who would actually act on any of it have never entered the room. Industry secured 7 times as many meetings with European regulators as civil society did. The field itself rewards researchers over advocates by nearly 4 to 1. We are, in other words, extraordinarily good at generating knowledge and extraordinarily bad at moving it into any mind that holds power. And that little database tool, I promised it belonged here, and it does. Because it represents the substrate underneath all of this, the quiet, competent, unglamorous work of people who simply want their software to do slightly more, to accept a snippet of code where before it wanted a file, to store a zip code as text so the leading 0 survives. That is the actual texture of computing. Precise, incremental, comprehensible. And it stands in almost total contrast to the frontier, where the defining feature is that nobody fully understands the thing they've built, not the makers, not the auditors, not the regulators, and certainly not the users being asked to grant an agent permission to roam their files for hours. That's the state of the field as I read it, not a story of intelligence arriving. A story of a comprehension gap, between what these systems can do, what we can verify about them, and who is empowered to decide anything at all. 3 announcements, 3 distances, 1 widening fault line. So here is where we're headed. Next, I want to take that gap seriously on the technical side to ask whether looking inside the black box is a solvable problem or a receding horizon. And then, in our final stretch, the harder question: if the bottleneck really is political will rather than knowledge, what on earth do the knowledgeable owe the rest of us? Stay with me. There's a moment in every technological era where the noise becomes so dense you can no longer hear the signal, where the sheer volume of announcements, each demanding to be the most important thing that has ever happened, drowns out the slow, patient current running beneath them all. And if you spend any time at all watching what's happening in artificial intelligence right now, you'll know exactly what I mean. A new flagship model arrives. 3 sizes, whimsical names, a benchmark chart showing it eclipsing its rival by 13.1 points on some evaluation of long-running professional workflows across 55 fields. The rival, meanwhile, quietly trounces it on a different benchmark measuring software engineering, which perhaps explains why the challenger published, the day before, a rather pointed article criticizing the very benchmark it happened to lose. And so it goes. The prices per million tokens shift downward. Everyone is faster, cheaper, more capable, more ambitious. And here is the trap I want us to avoid falling into. It is terribly easy to mistake all of this for the deep current. It isn't. The competition between model families, the leapfrogging benchmarks, the pricing wars, these are surface weather. They're real, they matter to the people paying the bills, but they're not the structural trend. They are the froth on top of it. So let me try to name the current itself. It runs in 2 channels, and they're moving in opposite directions, which is precisely what makes the moment so interesting. The first channel is capability racing outward from the screen, outward from the chat window, into your files, your applications, your desktop, your working life. Consider the shift being sold gently as convenience, an agent that can take action across your apps, that can stay with a project for hours, that can reach into local files and desktop applications with your permission. Consider a telecommunications company rewiring its customer service, its network operations, its very workflows around these systems. The direction of travel is unmistakable. The technology wants to leave the sandbox and touch the real world, to see what you see, to act where you act. And someone put this beautifully in the context of augmented reality glasses. To build the product everyone imagines as the next thing, you must place a camera beside a person's eyes, recording continuously, and send that torrent of data somewhere it can be processed. There is, he said plainly, no other way around it. The trade-offs required are so high at a societal level that perhaps we should simply decline. That's the first current, capability pressing relentlessly against the membrane between the digital and the actual, and the privacy, the surveillance, the dependency that necessarily rides along with it. Now the second channel, and this is the one I find genuinely stirring. As these systems grow more capable and more autonomous, a quieter effort is racing to understand what is actually happening inside them. A hidden space, someone called it, a place where the model puzzles over concepts before it speaks. New tools, new lenses, attempts to read the machine's thinking in plain language. And here the honesty of the researchers is bracing, because the same body of work that celebrates these glimpses also reports that the plain language explanations can be almost entirely fabricated and still reconstruct the model's activity with near-perfect accuracy. In other words, a description of the machine's mind can be 99% implausible and still work. That should stop you cold. It means our instruments for understanding these systems are at present running well behind the systems themselves. And this is where the 2 currents meet and reveal the structure beneath all the noise. We are extending capability into the world faster than we are extending comprehension into the machine. That is the deep trend. Not which model won which benchmark this fortnight, but the widening gap between what these systems can do and what we actually understand about how they do it. Which brings me to the sharpest observation in all of this, and it comes not from the technical work, but from the governance side. The claim is that the true bottleneck is no longer research, it's political will. That best practices already exist and simply aren't applied, because the people who narrate and enforce policy have, for the most part, never had a single serious conversation about the risks. that among more than 1,500 submissions to global dialogue, precisely one mentioned the possibility of loss of control. The field, it's argued, rewards clever papers over moved minds by a ratio of roughly 3.5 to 1, while industry secured 7 times as many meetings with regulators as civil society. That's the current beneath the current, a race whose surface is dazzling and whose foundations are barely attended to. Hold that thought. Because it changes entirely what we ought to be watching for. Here we are at the end, and I want to try to draw a single thread through what might otherwise look like an unrelated heap of releases and announcements. Because when you sit with a week's worth of developments in this industry, the temptation is to treat each one as its own little event. A new model family here, a database utility there, a grant, a glasses debate, a peek inside a language model's hidden reasoning. But the second-order story, the one that actually tells you where things are heading, only appears when you hold them all up at once and ask what they have in common. And what they have in common, I'd suggest, is a widening gap between the pace of capability and the pace of comprehension. We are getting extraordinarily good at building these things and moving faster still. A flagship model arrives in 3 sizes, undercuts its rivals on price by a factor of 16, and is folded into Office software the very same day. That is a supply chain operating at a velocity we've frankly never seen in any prior technology. Meanwhile, the work of understanding what we've built, of peering inside and asking what the machine is actually doing when it answers, is celebrated precisely because it is rare. When a lab announces it has found a hidden space where its model puzzles over concepts and describes what it sees there as ranging from the mundane to the unnerving, the honest word in that sentence is unnerving. We are shipping first and interpreting later. That is the shape of the whole enterprise right now, and it's worth naming plainly. So what should you watch for? The first thing is the quiet reframing of where the real bottleneck lies. There's a compelling argument circulating that the constraint on managing these systems well is no longer a shortage of clever ideas. The best practices, such as they are, already exist, but a shortage of political will, of conversations that have simply never happened among the people who set the rules. If that's right, and I think it's at least half right, then it reorders your whole sense of the terrain. You stop watching only for the next technical breakthrough and start watching for whether the people with authority over these systems have even had the conversation. The striking figure was that industry secured 7 times as many meetings with regulators as civil society did. Watch the meetings, not just the models. That's where the future is quietly being decided, in rooms most of us never see. The second thing to watch is the trade-off that hides inside the products we're being sold as inevitable. Consider the argument about augmented reality glasses, that to build the thing everyone imagines as the next great device, you must strap a camera beside someone's eyes recording everything they see and ship that stream to the cloud, because no chip small enough to sit in the stem of your spectacles can do the work. The person making that argument did something rather brave. He allowed that maybe you simply shouldn't build it, that the societal cost might be high enough to say no. I raise it not because of the glasses specifically, but because it's a template. Every convenience arriving this decade will carry a buried clause of this kind, and the second-order question is whether we retain the cultural muscle to say the trade-off is too high, even when the thing is technically achievable and commercially irresistible. The third thing, and here I'll be candid about my own unease, is the fragility of our tools for understanding these systems from within. There's fascinating work on getting a model to describe, in plain language, what it's thinking, and there's sobering work showing that such a system can be fed entirely implausible starting guesses and still reconstruct its answers just as accurately while emitting over 99% nonsense about its own reasoning. Read that twice. A machine that explains itself confidently and fluently, and whose explanations may bear almost no relation to what it's actually doing. If our instruments for looking inside are that brittle, then the reassurance those instruments provide is worth rather less than the confidence with which it's offered. Watch whether interpretability graduates from a hopeful research program into something that genuinely constrains what gets deployed. And notice the countercurrent, because it matters. Serious money is now flowing toward alignment work, a $160 million grant, an explicit attempt to put safety research on closer footing with the labs racing ahead. There are detailed scenarios being written not as predictions but as recommendations arguing that the arrival of superintelligence could be deliberately delayed by a decade through decisive choices. That word, decisive, is the one to hold on to. The pessimists and the planners agree on something. The outcome is not fixed. It hinges on will, on attention, on people choosing to have the difficult conversation before the convenient product ships. So what does it all mean? It means the interesting frontier is no longer purely technical. The models will keep getting cheaper and faster. That much is settled. The open question is whether our capacity to understand, to govern, and occasionally to refuse can keep even distant pace. Watch the gap. Everything worth knowing lives in the gap. And on that thought, I'll leave you until next time. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.